Well, we have a great session coming up. View from the chair. I thought this was a really interesting session where we get some interesting insights for people who are in chairman roles and their view on governance. And Mike is going to take us through the panel discussion. So may I invite Mike and James and Mike to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, my friend.
Well, good afternoon, and we hope we'll be able to keep things a little bit lively. This is always a tough spot on the agenda, and we'll try to make the most of it. My name is Mike Moksick, and I am the managing partner of DHR Global's board and CEO practice. I've been engaged in work with boards and CEOs for about 25 years now, in board effectiveness and refreshment, as well as succession and recruitment at the board and senior C-suite levels. Now, prior to that, I spent 10 years as chairman, president, and CEO of a life and health reinsurance company. And I've been attending these meetings for probably 30 years now. And there have been very few of them that I can recall where we've had the opportunity we have this afternoon of having board chairs share their perspective in terms of the impact and influence boards can have on the success of their companies. And we're going to talk about 4 different areas where boards can make an impact and in carrying out their fiduciary responsibilities. Those 4 will be governance, talent, resiliency, and enterprise value creation. Now, I'm going to ask Mike and James to introduce themselves, and as they do, respond to the question of how does your board fix the line of demarcation between oversight and executive responsibilities. So Mike, I'll turn it over to you and you can kick things off.
Thank you, Mike. I'm Mike Morrissey. After completing about 12 years as president of the IIS, I became chairman of Protective Life, a large life insurance company in the US 3 years ago. Many American companies, as a lot of you know, combine the chairman and the CEO role. It often works. Occasionally it doesn't work. There's sometimes a little bit confusion about those combined roles. The parent company of Protective Life, Daiichi of Japan, takes a more international view that there should be a separation of the functions. So I'm the chairman. We have an outstanding chief executive officer, and we have a bright line between the governance and the management functions, between the strategic functions and the operational functions. So it's a very clear, bright line in our case.
James.
I'm James Vickers. I'm the chairman of Gallagher Re International. I started in industry back in 1978, working for a company called Willis, Faber and Dumas. And in Willis Re, we were sold to Gallagher just about 2 years ago. Gallagher is a very interesting company because it's a very, very high growth company, doubled in size every 5 years. And it's a very big company. We now have 50,000 employees at the moment around the world. So with this constant growth, a lot of it fueled by acquisition of smaller entities, the role of the board at a group level is very, very much more on setting overall direction and ensuring that processes are in place and that are followed. But then at a management level, those are delegated down to the management. We do, as an American company, and although we're a public company, we're a family-dominated company, we have a combined CEO and chairman in Pat Gallagher, who's had that role for 26 years. So again, a little bit different to a lot of other companies. Hasn't been much turnover in the senior management of the company, which does have a lot of advantages. So our board, as I said, are more on setting guidelines and process, and then expecting the executive team to execute.
Thank you. Staying on the topic of governance for a moment, are boards holding executive teams to a higher level of standard in performance today than in the past? And if so, in what regards? James, you want to continue?
Yeah, they are, definitely. Primarily because the world has got more complicated, and organizations are facing more diverse issues which land on the plate of the board, and they are having to hold the executives to a higher standard. And the areas I think that would stand out as the ones that are coming through more is regulation. We've had a lot of talk about regulation. We know that insurance is a regulated industry. That's coming at us from all sides in some quite unexpected ways sometimes. And again, as a global organization, it comes from all sorts of different countries. So that has become a major corporate risk factor that is absolutely on the radar of the board. And the other one is talent. If I go back 10 years ago, boards I was sitting on, talent was sort of vaguely discussed. It wasn't really, and certainly inclusion and diversity was not discussed in any serious detail. So I would say those are the two areas that have changed significantly in my experience over the last 10 years. And to be honest, frankly, quite rightly so. And I don't see that there's going to be any change in that in the foreseeable future.
Okay. Mike, what are your thoughts in this regard?
I've been a director of one or more insurance companies, life and non-life, continuously since 1985, and I've seen a huge change in the way boards hold managements accountable. The boards are younger, they're more diverse, shorter tenure. There's certainly an attitude of support for the CEO, but a willingness to ask fair but serious questions. And so I've seen not a contentious atmosphere, but a much more probing attitude between the board and managements.
Okay. If we touch on talent now for a little bit, as James had indicated, it's certainly an area that is of growing interest at the board level. How does your board determine whether you have the right talent on the board and in the executive suite? You want to start, Mike?
Well, it's not all in the numbers, of course. There are a lot of qualitative issues, but I've found over the years that thinking very hard about who a company's peer group is and measuring one's performance against peer groups really helps identify whether the team is performing or not. I also feel that by having a very rigorous system of assessing the pipeline for every senior management position, readiness of people in the organization to step up, and paying a lot of attention to succession planning makes a big difference in assessing the talent.
James?
Yeah, I think certainly in our organization, there's a huge emphasis on succession planning, which then leads into talent development. It's an annual event. Each of the divisional CEOs has to present to the CEO, chairman, and the board on 3 levels below them. And it's a matrix approach. And for everybody in those positions identified 3 levels down, have you got an emergency successor? Have you got somebody who would be ready now? Got somebody who would be ready in 2 to 3 years, somebody who might be ready in 3 to 5. Big emphasis on inclusion and diversity when looking at those names. And then within those names, picking up the ones where we haven't actually got anybody in a position, so management and then the board is asking, what are you going to do to fill this hole? Who's going to come in to do that? You're going to have an external recruit. But we're also required to look at the high-performing talent and produce for each of them an individual development plan that gets reviewed on an annual basis to try to build up the talent base within the organization. Our company is a strong believer on promotion from within. Doesn't mean that we don't hire people from outside, but the default view is always try and promote from within. And slightly shame on us if we haven't actually prepared suitable successors for the available jobs as they come up.
Okay. Mike?
We should obviously be looking at a number of members of senior management and assessing the overall strength of the team, but the CEO is the most important. And the CEO succession issue is looming very large right now. I read a consulting study recently that in the last 20 years, the average CEO tenure had gone from 12 years to just under 7, which interestingly is less than the average board member tenure. So it's very likely that every board member will have a CEO transition during his or her time on the board. They're not always going to leave at 65. They might get sick, they might get a better offer, anything might happen. So the CEO succession planning is really, I think, at the heart of the overall talent assessment.
Yeah. I want to add before I forget that we would really encourage you to enter any questions you might have through the app, and we'll be delighted as we get further down the line in this discussion to address those questions. So please keep those coming. Staying on the topic of talent, one of the real conundrums I keep hearing today from boards has to do with the fact that now post-COVID, we have different models with respect to how people are able to work, remotely, hybrids, etc. And the real question I'm hearing from a number of boards is, how in this new environment do we truly develop leadership talent? Could you give us your thoughts on that?
Well, I think you're right. It is a conundrum because it's interesting to watch some organizations have moved towards everybody's got to come back to work. We're a 5-day-a-week organization. But that, I'm afraid, is running the risk of alienating quite a lot of talent who do like the hybrid working or, in some cases, the working from home. So organizations, in my view anyway, are going to have to learn to cope with this. It's a practical way to retain talent and grow. I believe that the real issue is at the level people are at. I work in a global business, and funnily enough, working from home that we were forced to do produced a much greater cohesion around the leadership team. And why do I say that? Because our management calls have traditionally been 4 or 5 of us in London, all sitting around in a room, face to face, with all the interaction that you can get from that. And then another 4 or 5 people on the telephone in all sorts of other parts of the world. The fact that we're all now together on Zoom is a great leveler. We're all at the same level. Okay, very helpful, because we all know each other quite well, and we're all quite experienced. So in that sense, it's actually been very helpful. I think the biggest problem is at the more junior levels, where people haven't built up the experience, they haven't built up their social networks, they haven't got used to, leading and gaining the respect of people which they can sort of automatically command. Whereas more senior people who've been brought up and had that advantage over time can play. And I'm afraid that there is ultimately no way around it. You do have to find ways that get people together, to build the bonds, the personal connection and bonds, and also to allow people to interact and develop their own leadership styles, and for their subordinates to get used to and work out who their leaders are. So I'm not well, I'm sure there's some people who will say that they can run their companies totally virtually, and I know that there are some who do. But if you're in a people business, which I believe, particularly insurance, when we're trying to deal with customers face to face, we are a face to face business, and we have to find a way to make sure that at least those who we believe are likely to be leaders and those in the sales functions, they do need to get together. Maybe not every day, but they do need to get together.
Okay.
I think whether we like it or not, the 5-day every week in the office model is dead. I think 75 years ago, most American companies had a 6-day work week. That seems like a very distant thing. But I think, for most of us who travel a lot in our work, we've been able to get things done 3 days a week in the office. And so I think it'll work out. I was talking to Alex Macharski about this the other day, and what Marsh does, and they expect people to be in the office 3 days a week, and so far it's working. So I think that is the new model. I think companies have to figure out who on the staff is effectively there for a job and a paycheck, and which employees are trying to build a career. And again, whether we like it or not, a lot of people are just there for a job, but the people who are there for a career are going to have to do more, going to have to be together more. And this, if we can figure those things out, I think the new model can work.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about resiliency. We've heard a lot about the topic, and certainly in the last 2 days, the whole issue of the growing protection gap has been involved in a number of discussions here. The question is, at a board level, do we see that growing protection gap as devaluing the concept of insurance? And if so, what can a board's role be in addressing that issue? Mike, you want to kick off here?
Bernard Kotenko's McKinsey presentation made a clear reference to the fact that in recent years, insurance premium growth has lagged GDP growth. So the protection gap is large and widening. But looking back over a long period of time, I think the insurance industry's response to new risks has always lagged. In other words, in the very beginning, all non-life insurance was property insurance. And then liability type risks began to emerge. Years ago, we basically only insured tangible risks. Now there are a whole host of intangible risks that we have to cover. And similarly, I think the industry is once again having to play catch up, and will catch up to the opportunities in environmental risks, cyber risks, and you think of other modern risks. So yes, there's a gap. It has been growing recently, but I think it represents an opportunity at least as much as a problem for the industry.
Yeah, I think you can look at it in two ways, the protection gap. On one level, it's an existential threat to the industry. We become less relevant because we're not prepared to cover these risks. We put the price up of what we're prepared to cover, so the affordability issue gets worse, and people turn to governments to help. And it's happening today. You look in Australia, the new Australian cyclone pool. You look at what's happening in some of the states in America where regulation is so strict now, insurance companies can't price, so they're moving out. So it is a major problem, but equally, it is the biggest opportunity that's sitting there before us. And I think the role of boards is to provide the executive management with that longer term view and vision. The executive management, of course, are in the trenches fighting the battles day by day, worrying about all the various metrics and everything to keep the business going. The job of the board, I think, is to provide that longer term view. It's very interesting. In the UK, well, they've got quite a strong culture of non-executive directors. A lot of the push over the last few years on climate change and what it might mean to the company and what they should do has been coming from the non-executive directors. Many of our clients say to us, oh, you know, my NED's on my back about, you know, what are we doing about this? And there you actually see the real power of the board and that they're doing the right thing. They are pushing the management to think about these things that are beyond the next quarter or even the next year or two. So I think there's a very, very important role for boards to encourage management to think about it, to begin to strategize, and frankly to hold them to account and say, well, what are you doing about it? What are you doing on new product development? You know, how much money are you putting into R&D to try to understand these things? And then at the same time, be prepared to back them, because a lot of the new products, they're not easy. Insurance industry, we like lots of data so we can price things, but to deal with the protection gap, we are going to step into the unknown. And then the boards have got to be prepared to give the management some air cover, because some of those ideas might not work out. So I do believe that actually it's probably easier at a board level to think about these issues because they've got more time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the board has a very important role here in making sure the time horizon of the company is right. When I came into the business, approximately 30% of the world's premiums, life and non-life, were written by stockholder-owned companies. Now almost 70% of the world's premiums are written by stockholder-owned companies, and part of that has been managements have been more focused on short-term results, quarter-to-quarter, year-to-year results. Most of the people that will be making presentations to your boards derive a significant part of their compensation from annual incentive plans. And it's important for the board to make sure we're looking at the long term. We're looking at things that may not immediately affect the bottom line, but are important for the company's long-term future and for the world.
You know, while the concept of predictive modeling has continued to evolve, much of the discipline that executives have been imbued with through their training is a retrospective look at risk. And what can the board do in this regard to be able to help the executive team maybe look more prospectively, more innovatively at this whole issue? Because clearly, over the last several decades, we haven't been successful in closing that gap.
No.
As we get new types of risk, as we see the intangible assets and the risk associated with those comprising a greater share of the balance sheet.
Well, I think it's this issue of giving the executive management air cover. As Mike was saying, I mean, you know, you only have to look at the stock analysts' reports that they're writing, you know, every couple of weeks on insurance companies, you know, dissecting them in minutiae. You know, where is the next share buyback? You know, what's the next dividend going to be? And really making life quite difficult for the CEOs and the management to take longer-term decisions. You've also got a regulatory pressure in a lot of countries now. Very well-meaning regulation about making sure the products are fit to be sold and appropriate to customers. That's really difficult if you're innovating a new product. How can you test whether it's really what right for the client? You think it's right for the client. And it's those issues that the board has to give air cover. They have to be prepared to push back on the demanding analysts and the rest of the shareholders who want everything now. And they have to be prepared to back the executive management when they go and start discussing with the regulators, saying, look, I know what you're trying to do here, and it sounds sensible, but you do realize that this is constricting our ability to innovate on a new product. I mean, it's interesting. As an anecdote, Lloyd's of London has always been held up as a very, very innovative market. It was a place where lots of different types of policies were innovated. Unfortunately, due to unsatisfactory results, there's a much heavier central control on underwriting. And a lot of people have felt that heavy hand of controlling underwriting from the centre, although it's been helpful and produced a dramatic improvement in Lloyd's results, has made it extremely difficult to innovate within the Lloyd's environment. So the balance there, may not be quite right. And I think that can be played out, a similar story can be played out elsewhere in many other jurisdictions. And frankly, that's the board's job to help.
Mm-hmm. I think, like so many fields, this is heavily influenced by the amount and quality of information the board gets. Companies I've seen over the years that have been unsuccessful have often been ones where the CEO tightly controlled the information flow, had very scripted board meetings. And I find that as part of this sort of new generation of more active board members demand more. And I think the boards that have other sources of information, I insist that my boards have presentations from reinsurers, from brokers, from asset managers, from consultants. The more information, the better, and the less likely to fall into those kinds of traps.
Yeah, but I think it's also the makeup of the boards that have changed. If you look at traditional boards, a lot of the non-executive directors would have come from a financing, a legal, or maybe a corporate banking background. And the more dynamic boards are now mixing in people with an IT background, people with a strong risk background. Now, it does mean it's not easy to maybe construct boards for this type of, to get that right mix of people, but it is changing. And I think it has to change more. I'm not saying that there's not a place for people with an accounting background. Of course they have to be there. But the balance of the boards have got to change. And a good board will bring in individuals who've got different experiences that can be relevant to the company.
Mm-hmm. James, we're seeing certainly that post-COVID now, boards have really stepped back and have taken a more active role in helping to define the vision of the organization for the next 5 years out, and then taking a hard look at what types of talent and resources are needed to comprise the board than ever before, realizing that, as we've been talking, that it's a much more dynamic and challenging environment that the boards are dealing with, and that the way of staging that composition of directors in the past, of drawing upon, as you've said, lawyers and accountants, may require a broader range of skill sets, and people who are not only looking at the issues of today from a past perspective, but are challenging the executive team with some new perspectives and forward-thinking approaches to looking at risk. Yes. I want to move ahead, if we could, to the whole question of creating enterprise value, which is one of the most critical dimensions of the responsibilities of a board. And we'll start with a question of what should be the board's role in enhancing enterprise creation value.
Well, the insurance companies are in the business of assuming risk, and I think the board, therefore, has to, above all else, oversee the risk management process of the companies. The board's not selling insurance, the board's protecting more than, playing defense perhaps more than playing offense. I think setting the appropriate strategic risk appetite for the company's business, not managing, but overseeing a really robust enterprise risk management system. I think these are the most important things a company can do to make sure that in a business where big losses can occur, that enterprise value is moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Mike, could you touch for a moment upon what Daiichi's expectations would be of the Protectives Board in this regard?
Well, as I said, the first thing that they established was that they wanted an independent chairman to work with the management, but oversee the management. There's a rigorous capital management discipline. Daiichi has a lot of money. They expect Protective to make acquisitions, and so they expect proposals on a regular basis. But they're tough, they're demanding, and they're a good partner. They're a partner, by the way, I should say, is challenged now by the entrance of private equity into the life insurance business. Competitors for acquisitions that have a different set of metrics, different asset management philosophy, and they're making it tougher for traditional companies like Protective to make acquisitions at prices that make sense for us. But that's the Protective and Daiichi governance relationship. I have meetings, 2 physical meetings a year with the Daiichi people in Tokyo. I have a monthly phone call with the people in Tokyo, in addition to work with the people in Alabama. But it's a very interactive relationship. The people who run Protective these days are younger, fluent in English, very sophisticated in the capital management, and a very constructive relationship.
How many board meetings do you have a year?
We have 4 in-person board meetings, one of which I will be chairing at 3 a.m. tomorrow morning, which is 1 p.m. Tuesday, November 7 in Birmingham, Alabama. That meeting will run from about 3 a.m. here until about 8 a.m. here. But the 4 in-person meetings with typically every 6 or 8 week Microsoft Teams meetings.
All right.
I'll have lots of coffee tonight.
I think the first thing a board has to do, to be honest, is to define enterprise value. There are different types of insurance companies. Stock companies, quoted, private, mutuals, and each of them may have slightly different valuation metrics. And I think that's incredibly important that the board understands what they are. Obviously, publicly quoted stock companies, it's all about earnings per share growth, all of those sort of good stuff. Mike quite rightly has touched on risk appetite and controlling the company to make sure it doesn't blow up. But I think that the most important thing that grows enterprise value over time is culture, the company's culture, how they work, how they treat each other within the company, how they treat their customers, their clients, their external shareholders. As Mike said, the turnover of the average tenure of a CEO for companies not very long. But the culture that defines a company, if it's the right culture, should last generations. And in that sense, the board should be the custodian of that culture to make sure, A, it's an appropriate culture, but to make sure that it stays within the organization. I mean, I'm a relative new boy at Gallagher, having been there 2 years, and it's very, very apparent to me that the way the company has grown and the way that so many acquisitions, 40 to 60 acquisitions a year, are bolted in, and the management don't leave. They're happy to stay, despite the fact they've been bought out. Many of them are multimillionaires. They still want to work. It's all about the corporate culture. And in Gallagher's case, that was written 25 tenets. It's called the Gallagher Way, and that was written 35 years ago. And it was written by one of the senior members of the company. It's not, frankly, the best English prose you ever come across, but anyway, that's not the point. But it encapsulates what the company is about and how it expects to behave. And I think that's probably ultimately the most important thing that will drive enterprise risk value, and that lies with the board, because they are the ones that provide the continuity. They are the ones who are going to appoint the CEO and the other senior management. They need to make sure that those appointments are in line with the corporate culture.
James, how does the Gallagher board assure that that culture is being adhered to?
Well, I'll give you, for a start, if you go into any Gallagher office, you'll see it painted on the walls all over the place. No, they live it. It is the senior management of the company. They live and they live their lives, both their private lives and their business lives, in line with that. And they expect everybody to follow that. And if people veer too far away from the corporate culture, it gets called out. And eventually, if they don't fit, they have to move on, to be perfectly honest.
Does the board have the opportunity of one-on-one sessions with members of the leadership team aside from the CEO to personally get that connection of culture?
Yes, they do. They do. The board ask for presentations from the next leadership level down, not just the CEO. There's a lot of sort of opportunities for interaction. The board are encouraged to come and visit offices, talk to whoever they want to talk to. A lot of the board have an insurance background, and frankly, quite a lot of them know a lot of people within the company already from their previous lives. But that is encouraged. I know there are some organizations where the CEO really controls access to the board and does not want anybody else to interact with the board other than himself and maybe the CFO. That, I think, is a very poor culture. I'll be honest, in my previous company, that was a culture that the board were kept at arm's length. And that was really, I think, primarily to ensure that the CEO, who was also the CEO and chairman, felt that he was totally empowered to do everything. And that's not a brilliant business model, in my view.
Mike, if you go back a couple decades to the time at Protective of Billy Rushton and Drayton Neighbors, it was a company that probably saw nearly every potential acquisition that was on the table. Has the culture changed, and how would you describe it today? And is it where the board wants it to be, and how does the board assure that it's appropriate?
Well, I've been on the board for 3 years, but I first visited Protective Life in 1972 when Billy Rushton was the CEO. Obviously, I was a young schoolboy at the time, but it was 50 years ago. And the company was a not small, but nonetheless regional company at the time. It now has a CEO from New York, a chief risk officer from India. It's a very cosmopolitan company. And the culture has evolved to be very strong. Now, I would say that people are pretty good at recognizing phonies. A lot of companies say they have a corporate culture. Often it's just words. Google Arthur J. Gallagher and look at the statement of the Gallagher Way. That's for real. That's a real thing.
Yep.
And that's a company that really has a strong culture, and it's shown in the results. It's not just for advertising purposes. Protectives has evolved as the company's grown. Made 75 acquisitions over the last 10 years. It's hard to maintain a culture when you're changing that much. But I think the culture is strong. One of our leaders of tomorrow was mentored by a vice chairman of finance or protective, and he got a feel for how strong that culture is. And that was encouraging for me to hear that.
Mm-hmm. Good. Good. John, I believe we're ready for some questions, if you have any.
It's been a great session. Thank you very much. Let's see if we've got some questions here. How do we ensure appropriate board composition to deal with emerging risks such as cyber and digital channels? These are new risks where traditional boards don't necessarily have experience.
I suspect, James, in your capacity, you bump into this question with some frequency. You want to kick things off?
Okay. Well, I think there are two things here. One is this issue of looking at board composition and trying to make sure that you have enough diversity within there. But there's another side to it as well, because obviously that's not easy to achieve. And I think it's also where, from the executive team, need to think very carefully how they present to the board. I remember when sort of analytics first began to take off in the reinsurance industry in the 1990s, and we, my old company, we employed our first actuary, and we were terribly excited and thought it was absolutely marvelous. And he produced all sorts of complicated graphs and charts and everything. And we weren't getting much traction because it suddenly dawned on us that the decisions were made at the board level, and the board weren't understanding what we were talking about. And so we had a very fundamental rethink and said, assume you're dealing with an intelligent person, but they've never come across this before. How are you going to present it in a way that a layman can understand? And I think that's hugely important. I see too many board packs, massively complicated documents, and you think, well, it doesn't matter how clever you are, you can't understand and read that. And it frankly looks, if you'll excuse the expression, like arse covering, produce some huge document. The directors really are not they're sitting ducks at that level. So I think it's two stages. Try and update the board composition, but and this is probably where the chairman of the board comes in, make sure that the executive team present in an understandable way.
Okay.
This is a great time for insurance companies to deal with the emerging risks that we see. The aging of the post-war baby boom cohort, the youngest of which are late 60s, 70 age bracket, has produced the greatest turnover in insurance company boards that has ever existed. So a lot of new people coming on boards, and an opportunity to bring on the board people with experience in social media, people with experience in the customer experience, consumer marketing, different skill sets than we've typically had on boards, because there are more openings now than there have been maybe ever. Younger people, the boards have opened up more to welcoming still active managers onto boards. Companies used to resist having their active executives go on outside boards. Now many companies view that as a management development experience for them to go serve on boards. And I've been on boards where, chief technology officers at other companies, chief marketing officers at other companies have gone to insurance company boards with new ideas. So I think this board composition is changing and presenting a lot of new opportunities to address these issues.
Okay.
Maybe another question. The panel has talked about the qualities and role of board. Now, but as challenges and industries evolve, how will the role of the board change and qualities and skill sets of board members?
Do you want to start with that one, Mike?
Sure. I think most boards realize that more and different skills are required than what we may have thought 10 or 20 years ago. I think a useful exercise has been the construction by companies of a board skills matrix. If you list all your directors down one side of a spreadsheet and list across the top international experience, financial experience, consumer marketing experience, cyber and technology experience. You can identify strengths, you can identify holes or areas that can use improvement. And with some help from consultants and other advisors, if you build a robust board skills matrix, you can see exactly what you need.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think the boards that I've worked on that have operated most effectively are the ones that have regular external effectiveness reviews, where the board as a whole is assessed about how effective it is, but then individual directors are assessed and their strengths and weaknesses pointed out. I've been through a number of those. I found it incredibly helpful, not just for me personally in my own development and understanding as a director, but actually watching how, when it's done properly, it can really help the board work in a more effective fashion. Can, of course, be uncomfortable. I've certainly sat on boards where it's been resisted. No, we don't want a consultant to come in and tell us what to do. No, we know what we're up to. Well, the truth is we don't really. We need that third-party opinion. Otherwise, you can sit in a little bubble thinking you know it all, when actually you're really stagnating quite badly.
Yeah, I would say that generally when somebody is coming on a board today, the expectation would be that they would serve probably a minimum of 5 to 6 years on that board, if not more. And many boards believe that it takes about 18 months of experience on that board for a new director to really come up to speed and contribute in the same extent as the other directors. And I find that by really probing candidates on how facile and nimble they've had to be in their leadership experiences is a very good way to address the question that is before us, because I suspect that if the directors aren't reelected every year, it's probably 3-year terms that they're serving. And the day they enter that board seat for the first time, and by the time that 3-year period ends, there are going to be issues that maybe this board has never confronted before. And how are these individuals going to be able to contribute from their conversations and experiences to that dialogue? And the more we can get some insight into how they've had to be nimble, how they've had to be facile in their earlier career experiences, can give us some insight into how they might be a constructive director
I also
in this
think
environment.
to the extent that you want to shorten that period of getting up to speed as much as possible, having a very methodical onboarding process for a new board member is very important. You don't want the person to show up at the first meeting and try to learn on the job over the next several meetings. A really robust onboarding process is important.
Yeah.
Should we wrap it there?
Well,
One more?
yeah,
One more
we can
question.
take this one more.
One more question. If the board is the CEO's boss, then who is the board's boss? The activist investor, the media, the shareholders, the regulator, who?
Okay. Whenever I've gone onto a board, as a point of principle, I want to see the articles of association of the company and the matters reserved for the shareholders. Ultimately, the company belongs to the shareholders, the boards serve at the pleasure of the shareholders, and the shareholders are the one who delegated the responsibility to the board. That's what, of course, it says on paper, and that's the legal position you have to follow. However, of course, it's a good question because there are lots of other stakeholders out there whose interests have to be balanced. But at the end of the day, they are subordinate to the shareholder. And the job of the board is to make sure that the shareholder's interest is appropriately protected and balanced against these other stakeholders. They may have very valid points, a lot of them, and they may need to be taken into account because it ultimately adds to the value of the shareholders. But to me, and maybe I'm a bit simplistic, companies set up under the legal framework, it's quite clear, ultimately, who the boss is.
I have nothing to add to that.
Okay. I would just make a quick comment that there are two types of activist investors that I've seen in my experiences. And there are activist investors who are truly there to be constructive, to be a collegial member of the board in helping to sort out issues and to draw upon their experiences in making the board and the company more successful. There are also activists who do not operate in that way. And I had an experience a few years ago where I was invited by a board I've done a lot of work with to come in and present some thoughts on how they should be looking at CEO succession when an activist on the board, before I was speaking 2 minutes, basically stopped the conversation and said, listen, we're going to be selling this company in the next 18 months. Why do we need to be spending our time at this offsite talking about CEO succession? Well, they didn't end up selling the company, but this individual was not obviously being constructive in looking out for the interests of all shareholders. I'm actually working with another company right now where there is an activist on the board, very young director, first time on a public company board, who sees his role as being a disruptor. And he's achieving that to a point where the board, who is probably a very socially polite group, is saying, what do we do? So if you are on a board and you're being approached by activists, I strongly encourage you to meet with the activists, talk about and understand the possible alternatives in terms of individuals who could be brought on the board, and assure that if you're going to go down the path of having an activist board representation, that individual is someone that's going to be constructive. In both of the instances I've alluded to, the boards didn't do that. They were panicked. They were concerned that something, quote unquote, needed to be done, but they didn't know what needed to be done, so they acquiesced to the interests of the activists, and the activist was probably trying to get the most convenient outcome without realizing the kind of disruption that was being created.
That's great. Well, thank you very much. And you just had the view from the chair. Can you thank the panel, please?
Okay, thank you. Thank you.